Hi Ocean Lovers, welcome to episode number 7 of Dive Stories, brought to you by PADI, helping millions around the world to seek adventure and save the ocean. I'm your host, Ocean Allison, and on today's episode, I'm chatting with Richard Vevers. Richard is the founder and CEO of the Ocean Agency. During this episode, Richard shares the ways in which he brings his expertise in advertising to the world of ocean conservation, all about his role in the hit Netflix documentary Chasing Coral, and the many reasons he feels optimistic in looking to the future. All that and more coming right up. Thanks for being here. You're listening to Dive Stories. We bring the underwater world to you through in-depth conversations with inspiring divers from around the globe. Thanks for diving in with us as we seek adventure and save the ocean. Happy listening and happy diving. Today's Dive Stories guest is founder and CEO of the Ocean Agency and the man behind the hit Netflix documentary Chasing Coral, Richard Vevers. Richard, welcome to Dive Stories, and thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Well, it's great to be invited.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we're actually going to start out by diving right into what we call the Dive 5. And how the Dive 5 works is at the start of each episode, I ask our guest 5 rapid fire questions about their experiences as a diver and an ocean lover. So are you ready to answer the Dive 5, Richard?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Number 1, where is the first place you ever took a breath underwater?
Freezing cold Scotland.
Okay, number 2, in one word, how does diving make you feel?
Magical.
Number 3, what is one dive location that you absolutely want to revisit someday?
The far north of the Great Barrier Reef.
Okay, and number 4, I think I can maybe guess the answer to this one, but we'll see. What is your favorite ocean animal?
It's actually weedy sea dragons.
Oh, wow. Okay, I'm surprised. I didn't get that right. I thought you'd say coral.
Close. That's a close second.
Okay. Great. Okay, and number 5, last one. In just one word, what does the ocean mean to you?
Life.
Amazing. Well, thank you for answering the Dive 5. We're going to get a little more in depth by jumping into the core of the interview now. And I want to start out by talking with you about your early relationship with diving, because it seems as though being a scuba diver has been a major staple in your life, even since you were young. Now, I know you grew up in the UK, and obviously you just mentioned in the Dive 5 that you took your first breath underwater in Scotland, also the UK. But when was it that you actually first learned to dive? Like, how old were you? And what initially inspired this interest in exploring the underwater world?
I was always really drawn to the ocean, and I started diving as soon as I possibly could, which was 16. And being based in London, there wasn't much of an opportunity other than the swimming pool, looking at the elastoplasts on the bottom. But got really obsessed with diving just in the swimming pool. And then it all really took off from there. I went on a dive trip up to Scotland, which was my first one. And it was magical, even though it was so cold that our wetsuits would freeze between dives. But really, just a magical start.
Wow. So you love diving and you love the ocean early on, like you just mentioned, but your career actually took you on a very different path at first. And you were working as an advertising executive in London for about 10 years. And what I find incredibly fascinating about the Ocean Agency, which you founded in 2010, is that you've essentially taken your expertise from the advertising world and applied it to an ocean conservation nonprofit. So without going into specific projects and campaigns that you've worked on, because, we're going to talk about them in a bit, I'd love if you could just describe sort of the fundamental building blocks of how the Ocean Agency operates as this creative agency for the ocean, really unlike any other nonprofit out there.
Yes, and it really does come from that background in advertising. And I did 10 years at top London agencies until I had a really, really bad meeting one day. I think we'd been up all night talking about 4-ply toilet tissue rather than 3-ply toilet tissue. And that was my moment where I suddenly realized there must be something better in life. And I gave it all up, walked out of the meeting, and decided to become an underwater photographer. With no experience in underwater photography. And that led me on this sort of almost epic journey. It was never planned that I would sort of get into ocean conservation. But I found myself, when I sort of moved to Australia, noticing what was happening underwater, working with the conservation organizations. And I realized the biggest challenge of all is not that many people go underwater, and so they don't see the changes happening. And I saw that as an advertising issue, sort of a communication challenge, and set up a not-for-profit 10 years ago in Sydney. And the whole idea was to bring the skills of advertising into ocean conservation, and especially work with some of the biggest brands in the world, like Google and Adobe, etc., and bring those powerful brands into ocean conservation. And well, in advertising, you're always given impossible problems to solve, and you have to be very creative in coming up with solutions. And that's how it is really with ocean conservation. These are hugely challenging problems to solve. And unfortunately, with a lot of ocean conservation, you have to focus on the subjects which have popular support, saving certain species, especially the hero species. You can't really address some of the really big issues. And so you have to be very creative about how you secure funding for those kind of projects. And right from the start, we really wanted to focus on the issues that really matter and which have the least support. And that's what we did with the Ocean Agency. We allowed the problems to come to us, and then we had to be creative in finding solutions and funding for addressing those problems.
Yeah, it's all so genius. I think that where we often see the biggest innovations in any realm is when vastly different disciplines are merged together to kind of create something new. And I think that's been at the core of the Ocean Agency since the start, which is just remarkable. And with that, one of the very first projects that you and the Ocean Agency worked on was, like you just mentioned a bit ago with Google, was bringing Google Street View underwater for the first time ever. And this launched in 2012. It's absolutely incredible. For anybody listening that hasn't seen Google Street View underwater, definitely go and check it out right after you finish this episode. And your team did this, brought Google Street View underwater by capturing imagery of dive sites around the world with a super unique and super cool looking 360-degree camera, which you guys actually developed specifically in order to do this. And fundamentally, it provides an opportunity for anyone around the world with an internet connection to feel a bit like they themselves are on a dive exploring the underwater world. So I'm curious, for you personally, what does it mean to have the ocean included in such a major global platform like Google Maps, with these underwater scenes having been viewed literally billions of times?
Well, I think we were blown away by the success of the project. I think more people went diving virtually in the first day of launching Google Street View underwater than have ever been diving in history. That's the power of collaboration with someone like Google. They can just push it out to huge, huge numbers. And that's one of the biggest challenges in ocean conservation is there aren't enough divers, not enough people sort of going to see these environments and seeing the issues. And so, we knew this could really engage people with the oceans on a massive scale. And certainly we were delighted by the results.
Yeah, and hopefully those people that are going virtually diving with underwater street view are then inspired to go real diving, right?
Absolutely. And, it's seeing the reaction to kids in classrooms. We've done quite a lot of work in classrooms with Google Cardboard. So these low cost VR headsets. And when you see a kid going for a virtual dive for the first time, it's as if virtual reality was built for the oceans, and they get to see turtles. They're looking up, they're looking down, and you can see it's really affecting them quite emotionally. And that's the hook that gets people into diving. It was those kind of experiences, not virtual reality, but just watching films by Jacques Cousteau that got me obsessed with diving in the first place. And I think that's so important that we have the right tools for engaging kids at a very early age. With Google, we now reach 90 million kids with this educational program, which is sort of huge numbers, and we hope that will result in getting a lot more people in the water.
So, within this already remarkable endeavor to reveal the ocean to the world with underwater Google Street View, you and the Ocean Agency team were also simultaneously compiling the most comprehensive scientific record of coral reefs ever in a project called the Catlin Seaview Survey. So I'd love if you could describe for myself and listeners, first off, what went into making the Seaview Survey a reality? And secondly, how does it serve as a valuable tool for ocean scientists?
Well, this was, it came down to how we set up the Ocean Agency. We discovered this big problem. And it was from speaking to a scientist called Professor Ove Gilberg at the University of Queensland. He saw our cameras that we developed for Google Street View. And he said, there is a big problem with coral reef research. There isn't anyone funding a global survey of coral reef, which is creating a baseline with which we can monitor change over time. And that's hugely concerning because you can't invest in coral reefs and the protection of coral reefs if you don't have the data in the first place. So we thought, well, let's try to sort of achieve funding for a global survey of coral reefs. And that was a challenge in its own right. We had to find a company that was prepared to treat this like sports sponsorship. And that's how we pitched it. We said we would give them a better return on investment than if they sponsored a football team. And instead of sponsoring a football team, they'd be sponsoring scientists. And what we did was we worked with the team at University of Queensland. We gave them branded clothes. They went on these epic expeditions to 28 different countries around the world, taking over 1 million images. We had to develop our cameras so that they could get the right scientific data. And that was hugely successful. We achieved over 10,000 media articles, I think 10 documentary features, and it's returned a 5-fold better return on investment for the sponsor. So it's a different kind of funding model that allowed us to do science at scale. And now that imagery is available as a baseline for scientists around the world free of charge to be able to assess change over time.
Now, as you were continuing to survey coral reefs around the world as part of the Seaview survey and for underwater Google Street View, towards the end of 2014, both fortunately and also unfortunately, you happened to start documenting the third global coral bleaching event, which ultimately spread around the world over the course of about 3 years. And this is what your Netflix film Chasing Coral is really centered around. But before we get into chatting about Chasing Coral as a film, I think it'd be good if you could give a brief description of what coral bleaching is for maybe anyone listening that doesn't know, and then share what was it like for you the first time you saw a bleached coral reef during a dive?
Well, yeah, coral bleaching is, I mean, it's got a strange name in the first place, which throws a lot of people off. But what it is, corals are these amazing animals that have been living on our planet for 500 million years, and they've got almost superpowers. So they can clone themselves, they can grow their own food in their flesh. And that's really what leads to coral bleaching. They have this food which they rely on because it converts the energy of the sun into energy for the corals. But when the temperature gets too warm for too long, they have to expel that food and their flesh becomes clear and you're seeing the skeleton underneath. And that's the bleaching process. And if the temperatures don't reduce substantially, what happens is that coral essentially starves to death. The flesh falls off and it crumbles apart. And that's what we were witnessing when the coral bleaching was happening at the end of 2014. And the first time I really saw it was in American Samoa, where we jumped in the water and it was white fields of coral for as far as the eye could see. And it's stunningly beautiful, but tragic at the same time. It's really difficult to sort of wrap your head around it when you see coral bleaching at scale. By this stage, I've been diving on a lot of healthy reefs, and seeing suddenly a bright white reef, it just really hits you. Imagine forests sort of turning white overnight. You can't really wrap your head around it. So it was a real shock when I saw it in American Samoa, and certainly sort of drove me to want to do something about it.
Okay, ocean lovers, it's time for the dive log, the part of the show where we feature an epic dive story from one of our amazing listeners. This episode's listener dive story comes from Jennifer Fuller in the UK about an unforgettable dive that she had in Belize. Let's dive in.
Hi, I'm Jennifer and I'm from the UK. My memorable dive story took place diving in the Blue Hole, which is a giant sinkhole formed from flooded limestone caves about 70 kilometres off the coast of Belize. Due to the tropical storm a few days prior, I was not expecting great clarity, and we were told not to be disappointed if we didn't see much active marine life. Within minutes of our descent, I looked above me and saw a giant hammerhead shark cruising back and forth, along with large shoals of fish scrolling in the current. It was incredible to see the hammerhead in its natural environment, especially as the dive master said in his 15 years of diving here, he has only seen the hammerhead twice before. We were surrounded by giant caves and crevices, and I just had this feeling of pure tranquility and joy. It was an amazing experience and one that I feel grateful for being a part of, especially being able to share that with my fiance.
Thank you so much, Jennifer, for sharing about this incredible underwater experience you shared with your fiance in Belize. I would say that an unexpected visit from a hammerhead shark definitely makes for an unforgettable dive. Listeners, if you have an epic dive story to share too, head to PADI.com/podcast to record and submit one of your most memorable dive stories for a chance to be featured in an upcoming episode. We love hearing from our global community of PADI divers, so head to PADI.com/podcast today. And now, back to this episode. So, Richard, I want to chat specifically about Chasing Coral now. For those that haven't seen the film, Chasing Coral is a Netflix original documentary that was released in 2017, directed and produced by Jeff Orlowski and Exposure Labs. And really, it was initiated and set into motion by you, Richard, from my understanding. And the film, like I mentioned a bit ago, it documents the third global coral bleaching event and really powerfully reveals the impacts of climate change on the world's coral reefs. It's such an extraordinary film. I personally love and appreciate it so much. And one thing in particular that I want to touch on that really stands out to me when watching the film is emotion. Unlike many science-focused documentaries, Chasing Coral really seems to focus on human emotion as a key ingredient in telling the story. So I'm curious, from your perspective, What sort of role did emotion play in developing the concept for the documentary? And then what sort of emotions were present when you and the team were actually in front of the cameras experiencing this story and this bleaching event?
Well, I think I'd had a lot of experience of writing up about coral bleaching and getting it published in sort of major newspapers, but that kind of storytelling doesn't really result in emotion, and often doesn't result in change. You read these stories, but you're not emotionally connected to them. And it was really when I saw Jeff Orlowski's previous film, his first film, Chasing Ice, and he got me emotionally engaged in the story of ice disappearing. And I figured if he could do that with ice, he could do an unbelievable job with coral reefs disappearing. And that's exactly what he did. So when we started filming, he was really trying to sort of draw out my emotions in the storytelling. So he'd sit me down for hours on end and try to get me to show my emotions. And unfortunately, being British, I find that very, very difficult. So fortunately, Jeff found another character who was involved really on the technical side of the team, Zach. And Zach was just passionate about corals. And he really sort of was the difference in making the film such a success, because you really felt his emotions. And it got such positive reviews because of the emotional storytelling. Now, personally, it was incredibly emotional sort of seeing a reef die. I mean, we were camped out on the Great Barrier Reef for months on end, watching the reef that we'd grown to love die before our eyes. So it really impacted us deeply. But I think Zach was the one that showed that the clearest.
All of that emotion, the negative and positive emotions felt by your team while making the film, and then, translating to everyone that's watching the film, including myself. I think that emotion has been a key factor in the amazing success of Chasing Coral. It's received a wide array of prestigious awards, including most notably an Emmy for Outstanding Nature Documentary in 2018, which is just absolutely amazing. And it's also been watched by millions of people all around the world. So I'm curious, why was it important to you and everybody involved in making the film? Why was it important that Chasing Coral appeal to a mainstream, widespread audience, not just divers or people that love the ocean, but anyone and everyone that, seems to come across it?
Well, what's so important is the urgency of the issue. I mean, we are losing coral reefs at a rapid rate, and there simply isn't the support for action. And, often you get scientists raising the alarm, conservationists raising the alarm, but they've been doing that for such a long period of time that it's almost easy to ignore by policymakers. And you need a mainstream audience showing support to actually get action. And that's really what the film was about, was to ignite really sort of new support for coral reef conservation that could lead to action at this critical time. And, we've been really encouraged by the success of the film and what's resulted as because of the film.
Yeah, and speaking of that, directly from Chasing Coral, you and the Ocean Agency team, you partnered with top coral scientists and others to launch, again, another incredible project called 50 Reefs. And 50 Reefs identified a portfolio of 50 coral reefs around the world that, rather than bleaching, are actually remaining healthy in the face of climate change. And just a not so small side note here, from this project, Bloomberg Philanthropies pledged $86 million to support the protection of these 50 reefs, which is mind-blowing and absolutely needed in the world of ocean conservation, like you were just touching on. So thank you for being so instrumental in making that a reality.
Well, it was, we found ourselves, filming corals dying, and we realized we couldn't just be involved in the storytelling. anymore. We really had to get involved in coral reef conservation, and that's really what inspired the project. We were working with some of the world's best coral reef scientists, and we thought, well, let's do the science to find out which are the reefs that where we should be sort of bolstering our conservation efforts. The ones that are least vulnerable to climate change, which are most important for reseeding other reefs. And we made the project controversial with the name. 50 reefs was really highlighting the fact that there is a real lack of support for coral reefs, and there's only a certain number that we can really focus our attentions on. So coming at this from a marketing point of view was really the secret to attracting major philanthropy.
Yeah. And so with the name of this podcast being Dive Stories, I asked this question to every one of our guests. And specifically with you, I want to kind of keep that 50 Reefs project in mind because, these are some of the healthiest coral reefs on the planet still currently, in the face of climate change. So what is one of your most memorable dive stories from surveying and identifying these still remarkably healthy coral reefs?
Well, I think it would be just going to Raja Ampat in Indonesia. It is recognized as being sort of the most biodiverse place on the planet. It's the epicenter of coral reefs. And we went there before the coral bleaching event from 2014 to 2017. And we went afterwards. And arguably, it was in a better condition when we revisited it after the bleaching event because it hadn't been impacted. And there was these just certain dives you went on with 100% coral cover, so much fish life, and just the light on these environments it was mind-blowing. And some of the best dive experiences of my life happened in sort of Raja Ampat.
Yeah, wow, that sounds so incredible. Thank you for sharing. And I think it's so powerful and really actually relatable to a certain extent to hear you share, some heartbreaking dive stories like we touched on a bit ago with, bleached coral reefs that you've experienced. And then also, for you to share some awe-inspiring dive stories, like visiting Raja Ampat, and not just before the major bleaching event, but also after. So absolutely inspiring for sure for me, and I think for listeners as well.
And certainly got plenty more of the positive stories. There are so many places which are still in great condition, and that's why we need to urgently focus on sort of marine protection.
Yeah, agreed. Now, last year in 2019, you and the Ocean Agency launched another impressive campaign as a result of the not just bleached corals, but actually glowing corals that you observed and documented during the filming of Chasing Coral. So lay it out for us. What are glowing corals and what is the Glowing, Glowing Gone campaign all about?
Well, glowing corals, there's this phenomenon which is when corals get really stressed due to too much sunlight and heat, they can produce a chemical sunscreen, and it can be very brightly coloured. And we heard that the corals were fluorescing in New Caledonia and raced out there and jumped in the water. And it was one of the most stunningly beautiful, disturbing sights I've ever seen. The corals were glowing in these incredible colors of bright blue, bright purples, and bright yellows. And it was some of the brightest colors I've ever seen. It was like highlighter yellow. The scientists said the yellow corals were actually emitting light. So it was this unbelievable sight. We sent the images off to Time magazine, and they ran a story calling it Nature's Most Beautiful Death. And yet we were the only team to go out to record this in New Caledonia. And it was really at that moment that we said, well, this is like, the warning going off underwater and the warning for the planet. And we thought, well, why don't we turn this into a campaign using color? I mean, if you think of some of the campaigns that have been so successful, like the Pride campaign using rainbows, it's a way of getting the mass support for a campaign. And that's what we did. We teamed up with Adobe and also Pantone and created these colors, the glowing colors, and then challenged first the creative community to get involved, to reveal the ocean warning using these colors, and just have some fun creatively doing that. And that led to brands like the World Surf League getting involved. They even changed their competitors' jerseys into the glowing colors and had people like Kelly Slater, the 10 times world champion, talking about the need for coral reef conservation to millions and millions of people around the world.
While wearing the glowing colors.
While wearing the glowing colors. So we didn't see that one coming. But it was, a very successful campaign.
With the glowing campaign, what kind of are you working on now? Because I think you're launching some new aspects to that campaign.
Yes, well, 2021 is considered to be the super year for the ocean because there are so many meetings that are coming together, mainly UN meetings, to really set long-term goals for ocean protection. So this protection of coral reefs, it's protection of the high seas, it's marine protection. And it's really important that we get strong government action agreeing to those policies. And so we thought the best way of ensuring that is to show the face of support. And so the idea was first we'd point the glowing campaign at this. And then we thought, well, let's have some fun creatively about showing the face of support. And again, we teamed up with, it was UN Environment and Adobe on this. And we developed some Photoshop camera lenses, which is a Photoshop camera app. And this was a way that people could take pictures using these lenses and then upload their imagery, and we would be able to show these faces at the key decision-making moments. And that's a campaign that we've called the Ocean League. And it's really showing that ocean conservation, especially coral reef conservation, has got mainstream support. And the idea is we're going to be showcasing this in all sorts of creative ways at these conferences, doing photo mosaics and really showing that there is overwhelming support for protection to ensure that we get the policy that we need.
Yeah. And so exactly with that, to wrap up, Richard, I want to talk a bit about optimism when it comes to ocean conservation, since I know it's something that you focus on and we've already touched on a little bit. Over the last 10 years, since you founded the Ocean Agency, what sort of actions are you seeing people take from the individual level and all the way on up? What actions are being taken to combat climate change and safeguard healthy oceans that give you hope and allow you to remain optimistic when looking to the future?
Well, I am sort of a born optimist, and I do see real progress being made on climate now, and that is the biggest threat to the oceans. It's certainly the biggest threat to coral reefs. But what you're also seeing is these movements happening, and I think the pivotal moment for the oceans was the Ocean Plastics campaign. This was an issue that had been talked about for many, many, many years. But it was only had environmentalist support and scientist support. But suddenly it went mainstream when brands got involved and celebs got involved. And suddenly you saw mass support for action that led to funding, it led to policy. And there's almost a shortcut to action if you communicate in the right way and in a positive way. And that's what happened with the Ocean Plastics campaign. And we're starting to see the start of that with the Marine Protection campaign. A campaign for 30% protection of the ocean. And you're seeing a lot of organizations rallying around that cause to make it mainstream. And I think it will get there. So I'm optimistic about the future, even though there's a lot to achieve in a short amount of time.
Yeah, well, Richard, on behalf of our global community of PADI divers and ocean lovers, thank you for bringing the incredible documentary Chasing Coral to the world, for creating remarkably powerful campaigns that benefit ocean conservation and really the planet at large. And thank you for joining us on Dive Stories. It's been so great chatting with you.
And well, thank you. And hats off to PADI for really focusing on, I love the line, seek adventure, save the ocean. really focusing divers on ocean conservation, because I do think it can be extremely rewarding. And I've been on this amazing journey over the years, which has been unexpected, but it's all been based around diving, and it has transformed my life.
Thanks for tuning in to Dive Stories. You've just heard Richard Vevers, founder and CEO of the Ocean Agency. To learn more about the many remarkable projects and campaigns he's brought to life, visit theoceanagency.org and find them on social media at The Ocean Agency. Looking for ideas of how to turn your passion into purpose? PADI is on a mission to unite people from around the globe to take action for the ocean, above and below the surface. Like divers holding a torch, this growing community of PADI torchbearers lights the path towards a better balance between humanity and the ocean. You can sign up right now to join this global community at padi.com/conservation. Together, our collective light shines brighter. This has been Dive Stories, brought to you by PADI, Seek Adventure, Save the Ocean. If you love the ocean and enjoyed this podcast episode, please subscribe to Dive Stories in your podcast app and feel free to leave a review. Follow PADI on social media and head to padi.com to join our community of torchbearers working together to seek adventure and save the ocean. I'm your host, Ocean Allison. Happy diving!